start talking about the skeletal system today, and then we'll proceed from there on Wednesday, depending on how far we get. Oh boy. Come on, there we go. Okay. So we're going to start by kind of going over the tissues. Hold on. Sorry, almost sneezed there. That was bad. We'll start by talking about the tissues that are really important. So we're going to talk about cartilages and bone, and then we'll start getting into the actual system stuff. So these learning objectives are accurate, but they're not actually in the right order. Okay, so talk about bone tissue and cartilage tissues, and then we'll get into the functions. Oh no, I always put the functions first, that's right. And just give me a second to, everything is in my way. Okay. All right, so the skeletal system as a whole supports the whole body, and it literally does that by being a rigid framework for the attachment of our muscles and for the internal attachment of a lot of our organs. As a rigid framework with joints in between, it facilitates movement. So let me get my thing up. Where are you? Aha, there it is. Okay, so the movement function is something that it does in concert with the muscular system, which is what we'll talk about next. And that one is mostly due to what the arms and the legs do. So we call that the appendicular skeleton, which we'll talk about later. Other functions include protecting internal organs. This is especially true. Oh boy, this is just going to be super fun as I get the hang of this. This is going to be especially true of like the, come on, there it is, of the skull, protecting the brain, the vertebrae protect the spinal cord, the ribs protect the heart and the lungs, stuff like that. So those parts are really good at protecting the softer internal organs. As we'll talk about more later, the insides of our bones are actually where our blood cells are produced. So the system has a really important role in blood production. And then it's also a really major storage system. So mostly it stores minerals, in particular calcium, and it also actually is one place where we store fat. So there's a lot of adipose tissue inside of bones, and the location for that we'll cover when we get to the anatomy of an actual bone. There we go. Okay, so when we look at specialized tissues, bone tissue is only found in the skeletal system, and for the most part, cartilage is as well. So although there are other tissue types in this system, these are the two that are very special and unique to the skeletal system. Give me 1 second because I lost my chat box. I'm going to go right back into this, but let me just pop out real quick and see what happened to... Where did my chat box go? I made it go away, now I can't... Oh, there it is. See, I knew it. Okay, yep, hold on. Which slide did we need to go back to?
The tissues of the skeletal system.
Okay. Yep. Okay, so we're going to work our way through these tissues one at a time. We're going to start with cartilage, and then we'll look at bone. Okay, So cartilage is a very specialized type of connective tissue. So remember we talked about connective tissues before. They're all from that mesenchyme, the embryonic connective tissue, excuse me, and they tend to have a lot of extracellular matrix and cells scattered in between. So the cartilage has a couple of interesting features that are pretty unique. So it is the only type of connective tissue that has no blood vessels at all. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. This is so working very weird. There we go. Come on. So the term for that is avascular, so lacking in blood vessels. It also has no nerve fiber, so anything made out of cartilage can't feel anything. It can't feel pain. It also can't feel anything else. In order to make the specialized type of extracellular matrix that cartilage has, instead of fibroblasts, there are chondroblasts. So chondroblasts are in charge of secreting all of the components of the extracellular matrix. They secrete the protein fibers, especially the collagen fibers, and then they secrete additional molecules. And one of the big things that those molecules do is they hold water really well. And the ability to hold water makes cartilage really good at resisting compression. So cartilage tends to go in places where you want something to be able to squish a little bit, but you also want it to be able to bounce back. And so that's why we find it in places like between our joints. We have cartilage in between our vertebrae in those intervertebral discs. You might know people that have disc issues. The collagen fibers make the cartilage really good at resisting tension. And so those are pretty much the main reasons why we have it. Now, once the chondroblasts are done making extracellular matrix, they get stuck inside of it. And once they do that, we call them chondrocytes. Ugh, I'll get used to this. Okay, so a chondrocyte is a chondroblast that's already done its job. And now it's stuck in a tiny little cave that's called a lacuna. And it hangs out and it maintains the molecules of the extracellular matrix. And it's kind of there. So it's a component of fully formed cartilage. Now there's 3 kinds of cartilage. We're going to go through them one at a time. So the first kind, and this one is actually the most common, is called hyaline cartilage. Hyaline just means glassy. Write that on there. And it was named after the appearance of the extracellular matrix. So the extracellular matrix is just this kind of pretty looking stuff. We call that amorphous. Although fibers of collagen are present, we can't actually see them when we look at this tissue under a microscope. So, of course, as a cartilage, it's going to be good at compression and resisting tension. And so we see it in places where it's supporting and also reinforcing bone tissues. It makes a pretty good cushion as well in certain places. So we see this on the ends of long bones. So literally, most of the bones in the body have a little bit of hyaline cartilage on either end. Hyaline cartilage also forms the costal cartilages. Those are the cartilages that attach the front ends of the ribs to the sternum. So your breastbone. It also forms the cartilage of the nose. So all this stuff, most of what forms the shape of your nose is hyaline cartilage. There are cartilage rings in your trachea and also in your larynx, which is also called, write this down, your voice box. And that is all formed of hyaline cartilage as well. So it's located in a lot of different places, and it serves a lot of important roles. And as we're going to talk about a little bit more, hopefully on Wednesday, hyaline cartilage actually forms the entire embryonic skeleton. So before your skeleton is made of bone, it's actually made of hyaline cartilage first. So this stuff is pretty important in the skeletal system. And this is what it looks like. So all of this kind of light colored stuff, see if I can switch colors. That works. So all of this stuff is the extracellular matrix. There's fibers in there, but we can't see them. And then each of these little kind of clear bubbly looking things, that's the lacunae, or the caves that these chondrocytes are in. So these little guys here are the chondrocytes, the mature cartilage cells that made all of this matrix, and now they're trapped inside of it. So that's basically what it looks like when we look at it in different locations. The second kind of cartilage is fibrocartilage. Now, fibrocartilage is named because it does have visible collagen fibers when we look at it under a microscope, and they're typically quite thick. So basically, this is a fibrous tissue, so we named it fibrocartilage. Okay, so come on. Oh my God. Come on, there we go. Fibrocartilage, okay? Fibro for fibers. So fibrocartilage goes in places where hyaline cartilage wouldn't be tough enough. So basically places that need to, that are like really heavily impacted, they need a lot of compression resistance and a lot of tensile strength, we're gonna find fibrocartilage there. So for the most part, we see it in between our vertebrae. So those intervertebral discs between the vertebrae all up and down our spine are mostly made of fibrocartilage. We also see fibrocartilage connecting the bones of our pelvis together. So the pubis is the front or the anterior part of the pelvis, and the left and right side are joined by a little disc of fibrocartilage, which gives it nice strength. And then sometimes we see it in joints as well. So the most common place, or not the most common, but the place that people have heard of is in your knees. So a lot of people damage these, but the little discs of fibrocartilage in your knee, it's called a meniscus. And so sometimes people tear those and it can cause problems, but it's in there because we needed a nice tough piece of tissue to help your knee joint all fit together right. So those are mostly the places where we see fibrocartilage. Okay. And then I just want to make sure everybody's doing okay. All right, nobody has any questions or anything? Okay. So it kind of looks like this. It looks like a hyaline cartilage, but with lines in the ground substance. So again, lacunae, chondrocytes, and then we have fibers in the extracellular matrix. So then the last type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. And like the name implies, it's bendier than the other kinds. And the distinct feature is that there's elastic fibers in the extracellular matrix. And so we don't need this necessarily to resist compression or tension. We need it places where the tissue is going to be bent and it needs to spring back into its shape. So that's literally its job, is to keep its shape even if it gets bent. And so the places where we see elastic cartilage are your ear and your epiglottis. Your epiglottis is the little flap in your throat that covers the opening to your airway when you swallow stuff, so that you're not accidentally sending food or water into your lungs. So it's important. And then I'm sure you guys know how external ears work. Okay, so 3 types of cartilage. And so that takes us, after I show you this picture, so this is elastic cartilage. It looks a lot different because they use this dark blue stain to highlight the elastic fibers that are all throughout this. So kind of all of these lines here, it's all just elastic fibers that make it all nice and stretchy. And in between, we again have these chondrocytes in their lacunae. Excuse me. Okay, so then the other specialized tissue type is bone tissue. The really fancy term for this is osseous tissue. And the thing that makes bone tissue unique is that the extracellular matrix calcifies. So we have mineral in the extracellular matrix with all of the other things that make up extracellular matrix. So there's still fibers, mostly collagen, and there's still all those other big molecules of ground substance, but this mineral gets added on. And like a good connective tissue, bone tissue does have lots of blood vessels. So cartilage is super weird in that it's avascular, but bone doesn't work that way. But because it's got this special matrix, it also has special cells. So just like cartilage has chondroblasts and then chondrocytes, bone tissue has osteoblasts. Come on, there we go. Okay, so osteoblasts secrete the special extracellular matrix that is able to get mineral added into it. So we call the parts that the osteoblasts make the organic extracellular matrix, because it's secreting the different types of molecules that are made in the cells. And then after that gets made, then the matrix gets mineral added to it. The osteoblasts get trapped inside the matrix, just like the chondroblasts did. So we call the bubbles they live in lacunae, again, same term. And so once they've done that, now they become osteocytes. So they're no longer producing matrix, now they are just supporting the tissue they've already created. And of course, bone tissue's functions are basically the functions of the skeletal system. So they support and protect our softer body parts. They participate in movement by acting as levers for muscles, and they store minerals and fat, and they provide a location for blood cell production. Okay, so the functions of bone tissue are the same as the functions of the skeletal system. Anybody have any questions? So here's a picture, and we're going to talk more about why this looks the way it does in a little bit. This is what it looks like when you actually look at bone under a microscope. I like to show it because it's really pretty. And this is just a different picture. Same thing, bone under microscope. Looks very similar to cartilage, but just a little different. This picture is still in there because I just want to show you that when we look at the body itself, bone and cartilage tissues are often side by side because they're both helping make up bone organs of the skeletal system. So there's bone tissue here, and it's sitting right next to this cartilage here and this cartilage here. So again, some bone, and then a bunch of cartilage over here. And then this is actually where blood cells are being produced. So when we look at it in the body, everything is all together. Okay, so when we put all that together and we go back and look at the skeletal system, we find that the system itself is composed of individual bone organs. So we have 206 named bones, as in bones where if you looked it up in like an anatomy textbook, they have their own name. And I say that because we actually typically have some bones that don't have names too, which we'll talk about later. So when we look at a bone organ, while it's primarily composed of that osseous connective tissue, that same bone, that bone tissue that we just talked about, it's made up of a bunch of other stuff too, right? So we're going to have blood vessels, we're going to have nerves, we're going to have fat tissue, so adipose. We're going to have some cartilage tissue, and we typically also have some fibrous or dense connective tissue as well. And then, as we've looked at already too, we're going to have bone marrow, so we're going to have parts inside of these bone organs where blood cells are being produced. When we combine all of those tissues together, we get what we usually call a bone, which is an organ of the skeletal system. So we talked about the integumentary system, we kind of just have the one organ, right? It's just the skin, and skin is continuous all the way around the body. But when we look at the skeletal system, we see that it's a bunch of separate organs all together working as a system. And we're going to see that most systems are more like that than like integumentary system. Okay, so that leads us to this important point that we want to clarify before we dig into some system details, which is when we say bone, what do we mean? So it depends on context, because when we say bone, we can either mean bone is a tissue or bone is an organ. The word technically means either one. And so osseous tissue is what we've already talked about. It's bone tissue, it's a connective tissue where we have a mineralized extracellular matrix, and the cells are the osteocytes trapped in their lacunae. And so, you know, if you're talking about tissues, you're talking about stuff on the microscopic level, you're probably talking about bone as a tissue. But when we're talking about the whole system and we say bone, we usually mean what we just talked about. So the organ composed of osseous tissue plus all of these other tissues. Okay, so that's just kind of one of those things where it's kind of a good explanation of why we have all of this terminology, because if we try to use the terms that we use in everyday speech, there can be confusion. Whereas if we use the proper terms, then we can be more clear about it. So let's start looking at these bone organs. Do that, and then, okay, there we go. Okay, so when we look at all of these bones together, these 206 named bones plus a couple of unnamed bones, we can see that we can divide the anatomy of the skeletal system into regions, very similarly to the body regions that I introduced you to in the first lecture. So the two main regions of the body are, of course, the axial region, which is, you know, everything in the center of the body. So the axis of the body, head, neck, rib cage, and vertebral column. And then the appendicular part of the skeleton is, of course, the limbs. So we've got upper limbs, that's rib, scapula, and collarbones too. Oh boy. I'm gonna have to get better at this. And now it's not working. And then, come on. And then we've got pelvis and hips and lower limbs. Okay, good enough. Okay, so when we talk about axial versus appendicular, we see that they frequently have kind of different functions. So when we look at the axial skeleton, we see that it primarily carries out the supporting and protecting roles of the skeleton. So we're protecting a lot of the soft internal organs. We're providing support for other parts of the body, or we're like carrying body parts inside. And then we look at the appendicular region, we see that this is mostly the movement part. And when we look at, you know, especially our hands, we see that movement includes manipulation of the environment. So we can also think about that as interaction with the environment. So that's one of the reasons why we like to divide this into regions, is because they do have different roles. Now, all of the other functions of the system, like the mineral storage and the bone marrow and all of that, apply to both regions. But as far as these parts of the function, they're more specific to axial and appendicular. One second. Okay. So some diagrams of that. So you can see we have axial. Come on. Oh boy. Try that again. Axial over here. And appendicular is highlighted over here. Like that. Now, it should come as no surprise that we can also categorize these bone organs in other ways as well. So this is kind of how we categorize them from the point of view of location on the body. But when we look at bones as whole separate things, we tend to classify them by shape. So we have 4 main categories of shape, and then we have 2 bonus categories of shape. And I'm going to go through them one at a time. So this is just your overall list, but each of these has their own slide, and we'll go through what each shape means. So if you don't get this all written down, don't worry about it, because we're going to hit each one. So first shape, is the picture of all of them. So I'll just briefly look at that, I guess, since I posted it. So flat bones are defined as, being flat. That one's shocking. Long bones, though, long bones are longer than they are wide. We also have short bones. Short bones are about as long as they are wide. And all of this is on the slides coming up too. Irregular bones are ones that don't fit those other categories. And then sesamoid bones are kind of little and roundish, and we'll talk about that more in a second. So we'll start with flat bones. Flat bones are more specifically defined as being thin plates of bone. They're kind of like bone sandwiches. So we have these 2 like thin sheets of bone, and it ends up forming this flat thing. Now they're not usually like flat though. There's usually a curve to the bone, because most of these are bones of the skull, and so they're going to curve around the skull and fit that shape. But this also includes your sternum, so your breastbone, your ribs, and then your scapulae, or we usually think about those as your shoulder blades. So this is your scapula down here, and it's quite flat as well. most of the flat bones, because they're on the axial skeleton, their job is to protect internal organs. The scapulae don't really do that. They're just attachment points for muscles, and they're gonna, of course, aid in movement. A lot of movement is gonna come through those arms, and your scapulae are the first bones of your arms. So that's flat bones. And we'll talk a little bit more about bones of your skull later. There's some other details to cover there. Yeah, they're flat. Makes it easy to remember. Long bones are the other super common one. They're longer than they are wide. Almost all the bones of the appendicular skeleton are long bones. So your like literally your arm bones, leg bones, and your finger and toe bones, all of those are long bones. It doesn't matter how big the whole bone is. So, you know, some of the bones of your fingers are pretty small, but they're still longer than they are wide, and so they're long bones. So the primary function of long bones is to serve as levers, so that when muscles contract across a set of long bones that are connected to each other, we get movement. And we'll talk more about that when we get to joints and when we get to the muscular system, but that's basically why we have long bones. Nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Go there. Okay, so I don't know why. I think just because I have a lot of these. Here's another one, even though we're not done yet. So again, here's some more long bones. So this is the femur, that's your thigh bone. And this is your radius and ulna, that's the bones of your forearm. And then here is your sternum, another flat bone. And we're going to talk about short and irregular next. So short bones, you might also see them called cuboidal bones. They're literally about as wide as they are long. So, you know, they're little and cube shaped. And the locations for these guys are in your wrist and your ankles. It's really the only place we find them. The correct term for wrists is carpal and ankle is tarsal. So short bones are also called tarsal bones and carpal bones. And the function here, you know, they're not long, so they can't serve as levers. And they're not flat and covering internal organs, so not protecting anything. But what they do is they help stabilize joints with a lot of mobility, and help kind of provide support for the tendons that run across them between other bones. So basically, especially when you look at the wrist has a lot of movement to it. And so if it was just a couple of bones meeting and moving, it wouldn't be quite as stable or capable of the like fine movements that it has. So instead we have a bunch of tiny bones in there to help. Okay, so that's our short bones. They do have those very specific locations. And then this is totally opposed to irregular bones, which are like everywhere. So basically anything that's not long or flat or short is an irregular shaped bone. Great example of that is the vertebrae. So these are the vertebrae, the bones of your backbone. And they're funky shaped. They've got a lot of stuff going. Other bones like that are the bones of your face. So the bones around your brain are flat, but then all the little bones up here are typically irregular. And so they don't have any particular function because they're all over the place and do different things. So we just give them the general function of attachment site for muscles, which is basically what all bones do. But when you look at specific ones, like your vertebrae also protect your spinal cord. So your spinal cord sits right here. And so that's got a major protective function as well. So those are our four main categories. But we also have some other ones. So the sesamoid bones, Sesamoid means sesame seeds. So most of the sesamoid bones are teeny tiny. They literally look like sesame seeds. And the thing that makes them a category is that they all form inside of tendons as they run over joints. The only sesamoid bones that pretty much everybody has are the patella. So the plural is actually patellae. So the patella, or your knee bone, you know, the little guy that moves when you flex and extend your knee, is a sesamoid bone. It runs in the tendon that, you know, lets you extend your knee. All of the other ones are in places like your fingers and your toes, and we don't all make the same ones. So basically, they help protect tendons as they run across joints from the compressive forces that they're being subjected to. So each individual person will make bones in some of those tendons and not make bones in others because of the individual compressive forces across each joint. So the patellae are the ones where almost everybody has them. It's considered like a disorder if you don't have patellae. And it's very, very common. Let me see if I put the picture in. Yep. It's very, very common to have them at the base of your thumb and the base of your big toe. So these are the second most common place for sesamoids. But like this radiograph picture here, all of these little dots that it's showing you, these are all different places where people often have sesamoids. So at any of your finger joints or your toe joints, you might have tiny bones inside of the tendons that run across them. So that's what sesamoids are. Double joints. Ooh, good question. So no. The short answer to that is no. And we'll talk about that more when we get to joints. But basically, people that are considered double jointed just have more flexibility than other people. So basically, their joints are bendier than other people. And that has pros and cons to it. So it can be an advantage to be more flexible, but that also means they're more at risk of dislocating those joints and having those bones not stay connected properly. But we can talk about that more when we get to joints, hopefully on Wednesday, if you'd like. Okay, so that's sesamoids. And the last type of bone is the most variable from person to person. So sutural bone is what we call bone that kind of forms as extra bone in between the flat bones of the skull. So it's always flat bone. And these places here, those are called sutures. Oh my God, I can't, hold on. Can't spell. Where's the eraser? That's just sad. Okay, try that again. Okay, suture. So a suture, as we will hopefully talk about soon, is what we call the connection or the joint between bones of the skull. So all of these guys, you know, I'm sure you've all seen them because we use skulls in a lot of stuff. Those are sutures. Now, sutures form originally as these really big, broad bands of connective tissue that we call those soft spots in babies. And so sometimes when they're coming together to form the actual connections between the bones, separate bones form instead. So then we have these little extra bones in between the proper bones of the skull, and we call those sutural bones. So they don't have their own names. They don't count as the 206. And again, they're highly variable by individual. There's no particular consequences of them. It just makes us all a little bit more unique. So that's the last category of bones. So you can see that, you know, the other types, everybody has them, right? We all have flat bones, long bones, short bones, and irregular bones. We should all have sesamoids, but exactly how many depends. And then some of us have sutural bone, but it's all going to be a little bit different. And it doesn't really have any effect on us. It just is what it is. So we can categorize all the bones in the body that way. What holds the sutural bone? So here, hold on, let me go back to that. So if you look at both of these pictures, these bones are being held together. We'll talk more about the suture as a joint later, but basically there are these teeny tiny little collagen fibers connecting the bones to each other. So the sutural bone is going to have the same thing in there. There's just going to be a bunch of teeny tiny little collagen fibers connecting all these guys together. And if you look at, let me make that go away. So if you look at the patterning on here, see how interlocking it is? That interlocking also helps hold it together. But we'll get into the details of that when we get to the joints as well. Any other questions? So that's pretty much our time. So we're gonna have to pick this up on Wednesday, and I will, as I said, whatever we don't get to this week, I'll do as a recorded lecture and post it so that you guys can watch it. If you have any questions about it, we can tackle it next week before we start on muscles. So anybody have any questions on that lecture or anything else before we adjourn? All right, if you're good and you don't have any questions, you are free to go. I will stick around for 5 minutes or so if anybody wants to ask me something. Again, remember, if we're here live and you want to ask me something in private, you can always go to the group chat and click on who it's going to. If you just click to me, it'll go privately, or you can email me later or something like that. Okay, so hope you guys are all hanging in there. I know everything's tough and uncertain right now, but we'll get through this, and hopefully we'll get through the class too. Okay, and I'll see you all on Wednesday.